Kevin Costner has starred in a ton of movies during his lengthy career. Over that time period, he has stepped behind the camera to direct 3 times. The first was in 1990 with Dances with Wolves. It won multiple Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. 2003's Open Range is a fantastic Western that is extremely underappreciated. Sandwiched in between those two critical hits is 1997's The Postman. It's currently sitting at 8% on Rotten Tomatoes. That means 8% of critics liked it. I've never actually seen The Postman and am writing and recording this introduction before watching it. I'm very curious to see how this goes. Okay, let's get this over with. Thank you so much for checking out the review. Before we get started, click on that red subscribe button and the notification bell. That way you know whenever I post a new video. I'm reviewing this alongside Kevin Costner's other post-apocalyptic film, Waterworld, so go check that one out too. I'll link to it down in the description. The Postman takes place in a 2013 America that has been devastated by war and plague. The government of the United States has been reduced to complete ruin, and the Pacific Northwest has become a wasteland. 2013, huh? Looks like you guys were just like 7 years too early. Our film follows a traveling performer without a name played by Kevin Costner. He has a mule named Bill and goes from town to town reciting Shakespeare and entertaining the locals. Because we wouldn't have a movie otherwise, the Wanderer is eventually conscripted into a regional militia called Holnists by the terrifying and psychotic General Bethlehem, who is far and away the best part of this movie. When he eventually manages to escape the militia, the Wanderer finds himself hiding out in a postman's mail truck. He borrows the dead man's gear and assumes that position, despite the Postal Service being long since abandoned. When he comes across the nearest settlement, he starts rifling through his mailbag in order to convince the town sheriff that the Postal Service has been reactivated by a US government that's slowly coming back to life. Seems like a pretty complicated plan to come up with on the fly, but he finds a letter for a woman in town, and it works well enough to convince most of the settlement. Because our hero has dug himself into a pickle, he's forced to keep the lie going as long as possible, and accidentally inspires hope in the town's youth. Whoops. The kids begin riding on horseback and establishing mail routes throughout the area to connect lost relatives and friends via the service. When General Bethlehem eventually discovers what's happening, he decides to squash whatever this is before it becomes a rebellion. The Postman desperately wants to be a film about hope, and you can certainly commend the filmmakers for doing their very best to shove that message into every single frame of this 2-hour and 55-minute movie. So that's the first problem you'll notice, that the movie is at least 30 to 45 minutes too long. You can make a 3-hour movie, but it needs to feel like it's going by quickly. My 2 best examples of this are probably The Wolf of Wall Street and Avengers Endgame, a pair of films in which stuff is constantly happening, and that 3-hour runtime ends up being just perfect. Those movies certainly have their quieter moments, but are so frenetic and, more importantly, engaging otherwise that the time flies by. The Postman has the opposite problem. It slows down to an absolute crawl for very long stretches, and is never able to regain any sort of momentum. A huge chunk of the plot revolves around this woman that he meets. She's married, but she and her husband want to have a baby, and they can't because he shoots blanks. So they want this random guy who claims to be a postman to knock her up like 30 seconds after he shows up into town. This whole thing could have been cut from the film entirely and reduced the runtime by probably 30 minutes. And that one subplot speaks to another greater problem with the Postman. It desperately wants to be all things to all people. It wants to be a sprawling Western epic. It wants to be a post-apocalyptic drama. It wants to be a romance. It wants to be a war movie. Instead of doing any of these things well, it does them all competently, but leaves the viewer feeling exhausted and bored. That's the worst thing you can do with a movie of this length, and I understand now why it hasn't aged particularly well. Your film is nothing without solid performances, and sadly the results here can be mixed. Costner is good at playing the everyday man, but as these young kids start delivering the mail and inspiring hope in people throughout the region, the Postman becomes something of a symbol. That's not the issue. Symbols are inspiring, but with the movie spreading itself so thin and Costner's bland performance, all of it comes off as half-hearted. His actions as a representative of the US government all ring hollow for us. His fake letters from the president and stories about a rebuilt capital in Minnesota might inspire these kids and the townsfolk, but none of it inspires the audience. Now let's talk about my favorite aspect of The Postman. You might recognize Will Patton for giving one of the greatest speeches in movie history.
All right. Now, I don't want them to gain another yard. You blitz all night. And if they cross the line of scrimmage, I'm gonna take every last one of you out. You make sure that they remember forever the night they played the Titans.
That's Will Patton. He plays the bad guy General Bethlehem, and his performance here is something to behold. As the MVP of the movie, he's a psychotic, racist, horrible excuse for a person. Nothing is out of bounds with this guy. He executes men for disobeying orders, steals women from their husbands, and violently oppresses any and every settlement he comes across. Everyone in the region knows his name because he's used murder and intimidation to make sure they do. One of the very best scenes in the movie involves a simple conversation between Bethlehem and the Postman. They're talking about what they used to do before the war. The general hadn't been some great military mind. He was a copier salesman. He was, by all intents and purposes, a nobody. But he bought into this horrible racist ideology of this militia group and became the monster that we see on the screen. That moment completely disarmed me and made the character that much more frightening. Patton is typically cast as a good guy, and the decision to have him play against that type pays off in spades. You see what's happening here? There are some truly great things about the Postman. When it focuses on the world building surrounding the war and the history, it really does shine. It's too bad that so much of that is shoved into the sidelines, because that is the movie that I personally wanted to see. I also want to talk about another artistic decision they made, because it's painfully awkward and misguided. There's a Tom Petty cameo near the end that ripped whatever credibility was left out of the film. He's not just some character. He's Tom Petty playing Tom Petty in the future after the war? What? I'm just gonna operate under the assumption that Tom Petty was like BFF with Kevin Costner, because otherwise I have no idea why the world this made it into the film. This movie has some cringy scenes, and this one actually might take the cake. R.I.P. Tom Petty. My view probably makes it sound like The Postman is a complete disaster. It's certainly not. It's an honest attempt to bring a message of hope. Hope in a government that no longer exists. Hope in what America stands for. Hope in each other. Hope in the future. It butchers all of those things because it tries so hard to pound us over the head with that message instead of just telling us a story. They were so close, but The Postman is a textbook example of the moral of the story being undone by the execution of it. As always, thank you so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, click on that red subscribe button. You can also like and share the video because that tells YouTube that it's worth promoting. Finally, let me know what you thought of The Postman down in the comments. Make sure to check out my review of Waterworld, and I'll see you next Wednesday at 9 a.m.